In Deep 6, the 8th episode of Teen Titans overall, an ocean-based villain who calls himself Trident and seems to be able to be in multiple places at once boards a ship transporting toxic waste, probably from the toxic waste factory that we saw in an earlier episode, across the open waters of the bay of whatever city Teen Titans takes place in, and is even able to completely drag the ship under the ocean, though he does let the crew of the ship abandon ship and escape. He doesn't seem concerned with them at all. Obviously, all of that toxic waste being at the bottom of the bay would be dangerous enough, but now this megalomaniacal supervillain has it too, in a DC Comics adjacent universe. In a setting like this, toxic waste is basically a magic wand that he can use to do whatever he wants. So obviously the Titans go to pursue him in their new T-Sub, which does allow them to exit it quickly, even though the only one of them who can function under the water is Beast Boy. But while he's doing so, the other Titans are still all cooped up together in this big, cumbersome tin can. It's a neat vehicle and they make good use of it later, but I just don't think it's practical. Cyborg seems pretty proud of it though, so maybe I'm missing something. They run into Trident pretty early on and once again notice that he seems to be able to be in multiple places at once. He severely damages their sub, and Beast Boy tries to help them, but they are in the end saved by Aqualad, who was also pursuing Trident. Trident tends to cause a lot of trouble for Atlantis, in fact causing more trouble for them than he does for the surface world. And so Aqualad, who I am probably going to call Aquaman at least once in this review, so if that happens ignore it, of course wants to catch him and bring him in and end his various criminal enterprises. It's from Aqualad that they learn more specifics about Trident as a character. He is someone who is so convinced of his own perfection that he feels like he should be in charge of everything. And even though Aqualad does have a little mechanic friend who works with him under the ocean, who can help fix the T-Sub, the Titans are basically incapable of doing anything against Trident at this point, save for Beast Boy, so they decide to work with Aqualad. Beast Boy doesn't like this though, because he feels like Aqualad was trying to show him up during the rescue of the others. Even after Robin pulls rank and orders him to work with Aqualad, he still tries to compete with Aqualad and prove that he's better, something that Aqualad actually does kind of get into. But in the end, this means that they aren't actually working together, even when technically they are. Aqualad is somebody who tends to work alone, so he's slower to trust than others might be, and Beast Boy thinks that Aqualad thinks that he's better than Beast Boy. So Beast Boy doesn't trust Aqualad either, and so when they both encounter Trident in different places, and they each fight him alone, they each in turn assume that the other refused to come and help them when they encountered the enemy. Things end up getting really heated between the two of them, but to Beast Boy's credit, he shuts right the heck up when he mentions that Aqualad thinks that he's better, and Aqualad says that he doesn't. That maybe he is better than Beast Boy, but maybe Beast Boy is better than him, and he honestly doesn't care. He just wants to stop the bad guy. Throughout this entire episode, Beast Boy had been feeling inadequate. This was his mission. He was the only member of the team able to function independently in the water. This was going to be his moment to shine, and then Aqualad showed him up. And he's been dealing with that, the feelings that arose because of that this entire episode. And if he had just talked to Aqualad, he would have realized early on that a lot of those feelings were unfounded. But now that he realizes that, the two make peace, and they're actually on good terms for the rest of the episode. And now that actually working together with Aqualad is something that's in the forefront of Beast Boy's mind, he actually comes to the realization that that might be what Trident's doing too. Maybe he seems to be in more than one place at once because he's working with someone. Now, to be fair, I think most people would just assume that maybe he created robots through himself, or maybe he dressed people up to look like himself. But as I said before, this is a version of the DC universe, and this guy did have access to toxic waste. And so what ends up having happen is he found a way to clone himself. He did it a few times, realized he wanted to do it a bunch more, and so he stole the toxic waste to use in his cloning experiments. So Beast Boy and Aqualad team up to fight against Trident and all of his clones in this underwater cavern where he's doing his experiments. But they end up getting overwhelmed, and they realize they have to escape and try to seal the cavern so that Trident can't escape. This is when the T-Sub shows up again, fully repaired, and manages to collapse the cavern and seal Trident inside. The episode ends with Aqualad being made an honorary Teen Titan, given a Teen Titans communicator, and he and Beast Boy being shown to be on friendly terms, competing as friends against one another. And like the previous episode, this is one that just doesn't quite do it for me overall. I honestly didn't remember anything about this episode until I started watching it, which means that, at least to me and people with a similar mindset to mine, this episode's not going to be super memorable. And that probably stems from the fact that the color palette in this episode is pretty boring. Like, I'll freely admit that deep sea environments aren't super appealing to me anyway. Like, I love a good beach day, but the deep ocean freaks me the heck out. But still, there are really cool things that you can do with deep ocean environments, especially in animation, and this episode just didn't really do any of them until the very end. For most of this episode, the majority of what's on screen is just different shades of blue and maybe black or maybe some blue-green here and there. Even Aqualad is wearing a costume which, aside from some silver stripings on it, is made up of different shades of blue and maybe possibly a little bit black here and there, which is entirely appropriate for this version of the character, but still isn't very exciting against the backdrops in this episode. Trident is sort of a dark, muddy brown-green color, and so most of the time, the most interesting things on screen end up being the T-Sub, or Beast Boy in one of his green sea creature forms, but then, if the backdrop has blue-green in it, he blends in with the backdrop too. Even Aqualad's underwater cavern, where he first talks to the rest of the group, which the characters profess as being beautiful, is just more shades of blue that all run together. Nothing really stands out from anything else until the end, when the big climactic fights start, and we get a battle between Trident and Aqualad above what looked like volcanic vents of some kind, and then later when Beast Boy and Aqualad were fighting against Trident and his clones in his cloning facility. The colors there were at least a little more varied, even if the colors that were there still felt a little overused. And all of that's good. That variation at the end is good, but it does mean that the first 2/3 or so of this episode are scenes which end up blending together and are made less memorable for that. Like the previous episode, though, the character stuff in this episode is what elevates it. Beast Boy's feelings of inadequacy never really felt like they went too far, like they went overboard. And Aqualad as a character is perfectly likable. For a while, his behavior does make you wonder if Beast Boy's right and he is trying to show Beast Boy up rather than help him. It wouldn't make Beast Boy's behavior correct, but it would at least explain it. But I do like that it ends up just being a misunderstanding, that Aqualad is just someone who isn't used to working with people and so isn't very personable, and who enjoys friendly competition, and so did seem to be competing with Beast Boy from time to time because he was, just in a friendly way. Because that misunderstanding allows for Beast Boy to realize immediately that his behavior was uncalled for and show that he really is a good and heroic person at the end. That when it comes right down to it, he can put his own emotions aside and get the job done. The only thing about the character stuff in this episode that bothers me is, why did no one think that maybe there was more than one Trident? The Titans knew Trident's name before going down into the ocean to look for him, so we have to assume that they got information from him from the crew who escaped the sinking ship. And the crew who escaped the sinking ship saw him in multiple places at once. They would have relayed that information too. So we have to assume that the Titans went into this thinking that maybe he could be in more than one place at once. And I get from Aqualad's perspective why he wouldn't look at that same information and think maybe Trident's working with other people who are just disguised as him in some way. Because Aqualad understands Trident's MO. Part of his MO is that he thinks he's perfect, and therefore he wouldn't work with other people. But why didn't the Titans consider that? Why didn't the Titans go into this situation considering the possibility that maybe they were going after more than one person? Even if he was someone who had the power to multiply himself, they should still have gone into this situation assuming that they were going after more than one person, especially after they literally saw him in more than one place at once. And yet it takes Beast Boy finally deciding to genuinely work together with Aqualad to inspire him to consider that maybe Trident is doing the same thing. I mean, obviously, cloning wouldn't be the first place that their minds went to, but why did it take them so long to consider the possibility that there was more than one enemy? I get that they wanted to tie defeating the enemy into the lesson of the episode in some way, but they end up doing that later anyway, when the initial group of Tridents are defeated by Beast Boy and Aqualad getting them to fight over which of them is more perfect than the others. Granted, this doesn't end up ending the conflict because the rest of the clones still hatch and they still have to collapse the cavern, but that was still a scene during the climax of this episode which tied into the moral of the episode. So why do you need to make the Titans look stupid through the rest of the episode? I don't get it. I think the Titans throughout this episode should have been suggesting to Aqualad that Trident was working with other people, compelling Aqualad to reject the idea out of hand and maybe even fuel Beast Boy's dislike for him. But that isn't what we got. We got a mostly forgettable episode with a boring aesthetic and a boring villain. The only memorable thing about him being the twist at the end, which is only memorable because it was so predictable. If it weren't for the character stuff for Beast Boy and the fact that Aqualad is a genuinely likable character, one who does end up coming back later and impacting future stories, I would honestly consider this episode a wash. I actually take that back. There is one more thing of merit in this episode. That being a running gag of the female Titans, Raven included, being completely enamored by Aqualad's good looks. That was a pretty funny gag. Really though, this episode ends up feeling like a very mixed bag. It is certainly one of the weaker episodes of the first season and of the series overall. As per usual though, guys, I'd like to know, what did you think of this episode if you have seen it? Let's get discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.